Welcome to Listen Up, the Buescher Bible Podcast.
It's really hard to say.
Really hard to say.
We'll get it someday.
You know, the important thing is that we're trying.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not the important thing.
Okay.
The important thing is we get it right.
Okay. Yikes. We're very different people.
I mean, think about it though. If it was just about trying.
Are we going to have to redo this part?
People have been trying for world peace for a long time.
Oh my gosh. And then people have been untrying for world peace.
Yeah, I mean, but the important thing is that you're trying.
Oh my god.
Not achieving, that doesn't matter. We're going through John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18 first, because it talks about Jesus from the perspective of eternity and how he always existed with the Father, how he was always God, how he was not a created being, but through him all things were made that were made. And so when he came to the earth, he came in order to redeem what he had created. He came as the one that really all things belonged to, but we rejected him. His creation rejected him. He wasn't like, oh my gosh, I'm so surprised that my creation has rejected me. He knew that he was going to have to lay down his life for us in order to redeem us because of the sin debt that we had and we couldn't pay off ourselves. So using the sinfulness of man, he actually redeemed man.
Agreed.
Word. So we've been talking about the pre-incarnate Christ to a certain extent. And now in verse 14 is where it starts talking about the incarnate Christ. Verse 14, chapter 1 says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him." So let's break down those verses a little bit.
Yeah, it's a little bit more challenging to understand. It flows a little less simply in your translation, I feel like, this time.
Yep. You want to go ahead and read it in your translation?
Yeah. So
I'm using the New King James.
And I've got the ESV. "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known."
So what do you feel like is more clear about yours?
Mostly the wording. I feel like there are things that are less prominently used in your translation. And specifically the section, probably verses 17 and 18 were what I thought was a little bit more confusing. "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known." I feel like just those last two verses were a little bit more difficult to understand the concept of what was being said.
Mm-hmm. Read verse 18 again.
"No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known."
That's one of those things that's kind of interesting because this is where we get into a little bit of difference in text, the base text that it was coming out from. Because mine says no one has seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. And so I've got a little footnote on my verse 18 that in essentially the text that your translation used as the base text, it says only begotten God in that place instead. And so that's kind of an interesting one because that's not necessarily about the flow of the words so much as the particular words that were being used.
Maybe. Because it refers to Jesus as God there. Because it's saying the only God who is at the Father's side. So the Father isn't at the Father's side.
Yeah.
Jesus is at the Father's side.
And then who uses the word bosom today?
No one.
No one. So, I mean, side is like, everyone knows what side means, you know? No one's like, oh, I cradle you in my bosom. And people are like, what?
That's super normal.
It is. You're giving somebody a hug. So, but all those lovely English words, you know, the King's English.
Yeah, I mean, yours is the only real Bible translation.
It is. I mean, it's the authorized version. It's the authorized version by King James himself, the most holy man of all time. So if there is a translation, you know, that was trusted by the apostles, it has to be the King James version. So, yeah, that
above the original text.
Above the original text, above all others, yes. So above the Geneva Bible, above the Bishop's Bible, yeah. I think that's so funny because the pilgrims
that's the hill that people die on.
Oh yeah,
like, people
all the time.
Die on that hill for sure.
And it's because they don't understand. I just think it's funny because the pilgrims wouldn't allow the King James version on the Mayflower. They were like, get that heretical book out of here.
Oh gosh. No, I don't think we talked about that because I don't remember.
Yeah, because I mean, at that time they had a lot more conflict with church and state. So the Anglican Church was the Church of England, and if you weren't part of the Anglican Church, you were viewed as a cult and would receive persecution from the state. So that's really what the whole separation of church and state is supposed to be about. It isn't anything about the church not influencing the state. It is about the state not influencing the church, which is part of the reason that churches nowadays in the U.S. have a tax-exempt status and all of this other kind of stuff, because it's supposed to be a protection from the government, so that the government can't exercise control over them and dictate what they can and cannot say. Essentially, a state-run church.
Yeah.
So,
welcome to China.
Welcome to China. Yeah. And
it's true. It is pretty crazy when, like, you talk to believers in China, like the outside believers who are not Chinese and the inside believers are not allowed to congregate together. So some places they are allowed to have Christian churches, but you aren't allowed to have multicultural influences.
Yeah.
And part of that is just because the mindset of the Chinese people has been so driven into them over years and years and years that, like, you have to get a multicultural view to be able to understand the Bible fully. And there's so much influence from the government into those Chinese-run churches.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because the government is interfering with the church to a certain extent today because of the tax-exempt status. Because they're saying things like,
you're going to lose your tax-exempt status, kind of thing?
Kind of. It's more like if you use your church for a political platform, then you are no longer tax exempt. So that's been something that's been kind of in effect for the last 70 years. And so churches by and large don't talk about things that are political in the pulpit. And it's why
which is kind of crazy, just because it's not a political office does not mean, I mean, this is...
And pastors aren't allowed to say, like, who they're going to vote for or not vote for and all that kind of stuff from the pulpit. And yeah, it is a really interesting thing because through church history, through the American church history, like, that wasn't a thing. Like, if it wasn't for pastors, then the Revolutionary War wouldn't have happened. Like, honestly, because they were talking out about political things from the pulpit. And we've really gotten into this mindset of church separation of church and state means that the church is not allowed to participate in anything that's secular, particularly government. And so it's funny to me because the very thing that was supposed to protect the church, and probably has to a large extent, is now being used against the church, of separation of church and state. And you're tax exempt, but we can take that status away from you. And so, like, we see that in Canada happening a ton right now, because in Canada, you are not allowed to speak out against homosexuality, which is something that the Bible very clearly teaches about. And so if you talk about what the Bible says about homosexuality, you go to prison. This has happened to several pastors up there now. And this is exactly what separation of church and state is supposed to protect the church from, not protect the government from the church. It's amazing. He who defines the terms wins the argument. If you can twist the terms around to mean what you want it to mean, then you manipulate the rules in your favor and you win.
Yeah. And I mean, like, But even seeing that difference between us with you growing up being homeschooled all the way through and me going to public school, like I didn't understand the concept of what the separation of church and state actually meant until like late high school, because I thought it meant the other way. And it's just how it's communicated, and even just how people talk about it. Like children with misinformation tell each other misinformation.
Yeah, it's true. It is an interesting mentality to have, though, when you are learning that from the other perspective, because it makes it the church something that we need to be protected against instead of something that we need to protect from other things.
Yeah.
And so...
And that applies to all churches in this country. Like that rule of law applies to all churches within certain parameters, like you can't be doing human sacrifices.
Yeah.
That's not protected.
I mean, then we talk about abortion and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, the Satanic Church, I think, is suing the government right now, essentially for the right to perform abortions as religious ceremonies.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah. I mean, if you're doing something criminal, it doesn't protect you, right?
Yeah.
So, like all the stuff with drinking the Kool-Aid and all that, like...
Yeah.
That is not good and something that the government should intervene with, because it is criminal, you know. So anyway, here we are.
Long discussion, halfway through.
All that to say that there's differences in translations. So King James versus ESV, I think it's important to read all of them, because then you get the full scope of what the apostles were actually trying to say. Because there are small minor things that are different. So this being different, Son versus God, like clearly the text has already said that the Son is God and that God is the Son and the Father. Does that particular word change the meaning of the text?
No.
I think it just is stressing slightly different stuff. And so when it was copied out, which one's correct?
Both?
I mean, the meaning is there, right?
Yeah.
The meaning is there. And that's the thing, is that human error does happen, and it has happened with the transmission of the text. But I don't think that we've ever lost the meaning of the text without a malicious intent behind it. Like, there are groups that have maliciously changed the meaning of the text so that it means what they want it to mean. I think Jehovah's Witnesses are a good example of that, because if you read through their translation, it says something totally different in these verses, because they are trying to maliciously change what it means. The fact that we can have two different translations that are based on two different families of manuscripts and they have the same meaning, I think is really a powerful testimony to the fact that we have the original meaning. And I think too, we have essentially the entirety of the original text through all of the manuscripts that we have. It's one of those things that's really interesting, because we have so many texts that you can tell where there are errors in transmission.
And I think that it's also very interesting that, like, there's a difference between translation and even interpretation that leads to heretical outcomes, and difference between translations and interpretations that just lead to difference in opinions. Like, not everything is a heretical difference when you interpret things differently. There are things, and like that's when you have to kind of choose what hills to die on and what things are like closed-handed issues. But there are things that you can come to two different conclusions. It can make you live your life in two different ways, but you can still be one unified body with those interpretations. And I think God does that on purpose for some things, because we can't, as people, like, do everything to the fullness that he can.
Yeah. Well, God is not the author of confusion, right? He's not an author of chaos. So he does all things decently and in order. But I think that this is one of the key things that it talks about is, so in verse 17, it says, the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Like, God is gracious, and he's gracious with us in our weakness, and he knows that we are not him. He can communicate things to us, and he still gives us the grace to grow in our understanding of those things. He doesn't expect us to have a perfect understanding of them as soon as we hear them for the first time, or to have a complete understanding of them. I understand that Jesus was incarnate. I can understand that and accept it on a certain level, but then the depth that goes to, did he veil part of his deity in order to become flesh? God doesn't change, so how can an unchanging God put on flesh at a particular point in time? Does that mean that the Son always was in human form, or was there a certain point in time that he changed? And it gets really complicated really quickly.
I've never considered any of these things.
Yeah.
That also shows the difference in people.
For sure.
Because I'm like, yeah, it just is. Yep, said it. It says it right there. That's the thing that it says.
Yep. And it's usually as we get into a lot of these technical issues and we dive deeper and deeper that you start to have divergence in opinions, because people are trying to figure out with their human mind how it's possible for God to do the particular things that he does. And a lot of those things we can understand, but some of those things it's very difficult.
Yeah.
And if we don't have the grace for each other to acknowledge that it's difficult, that's when we end up splitting over things that we really shouldn't. But if we can have grace for each other, and if we can see that as a growing opportunity as we're continuing to walk deeper and deeper into truth, then that's something that's really good. I don't think there's a single person that I know that I fully agree on every single point.
Yeah, no, your friends disagree about more things than I think most friends do.
But about the really important core things, we are in agreement.
It's just scary. It's about a lot of conflict for somebody who doesn't like conflict.
Yeah, but at the same time, that conflict helps us grow more and more into truth, because sometimes they challenge me about things that I believe that are not quite right, and it causes me to grow in truth, but they do it in a gracious way. And I do the same thing for them. And so the law came through Moses, and it's like, this is the letter of the law. You have to do this. 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 And nobody could fulfill that. But grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. He's the one that provided salvation for us. He's the one that is the truth. And so we don't have to try to invent our own religion now. We don't have to try to dig that hard for it. Like, you do have to dig really hard for it, but at the same time you don't, because Jesus is the truth, and he came and presented that to us in its fullness. And that's what it talks about in verse 18, is that he has declared him. So Jesus perfectly portrayed the Father to us. One of the disciples at the Last Supper was like, show us the Father and we'll be content. And Jesus is like, have I been with you for so long and you do not recognize me? Because he and the Father are one. And the way that he acts is the way that the Father acts. And so he could say, by looking at me, you have seen a perfect representation of the Father.
Yeah.
Have I been with you so long and you don't know me? Which is really a crazy statement if he's not God. If he's not God, that is probably one of the most arrogant things you could ever say.
Yeah. Well, and there's so many things like that where I don't think that anybody who really thinks through it can really truly believe that Jesus was a good teacher and not God. Like, who really actually thinks through it because of the things that he said. If you take all of the things that he said.
Because I think that Hitler was a great leader. I think Hitler was a great manipulator. Really great orator. And he was a horrible, despicable human being.
Yeah.
But he did a great job of unifying Germany and driving people towards a common goal.
But when Americans say Jesus was a good teacher, there's a sweet Jesus holding babies, social justice warrior kind of like all wrapped in that. But it cannot take into account, if you eat my body, you drink my blood, like those kinds of things.
You have no life in me, yes. But that's the thing, though, is that people like to pick and choose what they want to believe.
Yeah, and we're not above that. Like, nobody is really above.
And the point that I'm making is, if you approach Jesus just as a good teacher, then you can ignore the lessons that you don't want to know. You can ignore the things that you don't necessarily believe, and you can just appreciate him from the teaching standpoint. Oh, this guy used parables so much, or like, oh, this guy did such a great job of using life examples, and what a great teacher he was. I don't really care for the subjects he was teaching about, but it really comes down to whether or not you're willing to submit yourself to what he taught. And if you're really willing to grapple with what he taught instead of just picking and choosing the parts that you like. But it's so easy.
It's true.
So easy. So over into Luke. So Luke chapter 1, verse 1 says, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had a perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." That is a mouthful. Luke was written by a Gentile. This is one of the few books that was written by a Gentile in the New Testament. Most of them were Jews. Actually, I think Luke might be the only one that was written by a Gentile, besides Acts. So, okay, one of the few books.
And we don't technically know who wrote Hebrews. So.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess it could have been a non-Jew, so that's fine. But anyway, Paul was a Jew, Peter was a Jew, Mark was a Jew, John was a Jew, Judas was a Jew. You have all of these different people. James was a Jew, and then you've got Luke. And Luke uses a Gentile style of writing. So he writes as a historian at that time would have written. And so he starts off his gospel with this address that is typical of the time. Basically, he's saying that he's studied everything from a historical context. He's really done his homework. He's dug in, and therefore he's going to write a gospel, and he's writing it to a specific person. And the person is Theophilus, and that's somebody that people don't know if that was actually a real person or if he's just using Theophilus as a general term, because Theophilus means lover of God. Luke was a slave too. As a doctor, he would have been a slave. That's just how it worked at that point in time. Yeah. So this is a really interesting thing, right? Because you think about doctors today, you're like, oh, wow, it's a doctor. They've got to be so rich and famous.
Yeah.
Like all this kind of stuff. Like, I bet they like studied so hard and blah, blah, blah. They did have to study so hard. And this is one of the differences between slavery in the Jewish time period, slavery in the Roman time period, and slavery during the Civil War time period. Because at that time, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing to be a slave. You were joined to somebody's household. And some people were good and some people were bad. And some people freed slaves and some people made slaves and all of this kind of stuff that you have like conflict-wise. And there were a lot of situations around it that were not good. But it was just a normal part of the Roman practice that when you went and took over a city, you would enslave part of their population, bring them back and sell them. Like that was part of the loot of war. So slaves sometimes were really gifted people. And essentially it was equal opportunity slavery. Everyone had an opportunity to become a slave. So all you had to do was either sell yourself or get captured and sold. You would buy slaves. They would become attached to your household and they really became a part of your household. So you'd have different slaves that would do different things. So you would have a slave that would run essentially the finances of your whole household. You would have slaves that like took care of your farms. You would have slaves that, in Luke's case, were your physician and other things like that. And really Rome was run off of slavery. Instead of having like the lower middle class, you had the slave class. Very different than it is today.
Yeah.
And if you really want to talk about like a social gap, then there you go. You got slaves and slave owners. And then you've got the freemen that were able to work at their professions but couldn't afford slaves themselves. So slaves were usually the ones that were trained as doctors because being a doctor was gross.
That is fair.
So you're a nurse. Have you seen gross things as a nurse?
Often.
Have you had to do gross things as a nurse?
Yes, that is true.
What was one of the grossest things you had to do?
I'm not talking about that on here. But I do, like, as a note, I do come home and, like, I don't touch anything. I don't let him touch me. I'm like, I am removing these scrubs and I am showering because I am disgusting right now.
Yeah.
And I don't know what or whose bodily fluids are on me.
So slaves were trained as doctors because free people didn't want to do that really gross thing. Mm-hmm. So Luke, being a doctor, would have been a slave. And so it's possible that he wrote his account of the life of Christ to his slave master and used the term Theophilus in addressing him, because his master was probably a believer, which is the only reason that he was allowed to travel around with Paul and his team and really essentially get a whole bunch of firsthand accounts of the life of Christ, because he was rubbing shoulders with Paul and the other apostles, Peter, John Mark, all of these different guys. And so he was able to compile that information and therefore set out this gospel. Mm-hmm. So that's essentially what his introduction is about and what it's for. So the two theories are that he was writing it as a general account to anyone who's a lover of God, or he was writing it specifically to his master when he wrote the gospel itself. And so you see in Acts, which is Luke part 2, that he begins the account in a very similar way. And I think one thing that's really cool about this is that he really did it from a historical standpoint. He really was trying to write a piece of history. People forget about that a lot because they just assume things like, oh, because there's miracles in the Gospels, it had to all be mythology, or it had to have been embellished and this and this and this and this. But for the people at the time, they were writing firsthand accounts. You could go and you could ask these various people, did this really happen?
And the people in those towns and stuff.
And it wasn't done in a corner. Like, it wasn't done in the middle of the Arabian desert where nobody was around. Like, Israel was one of the major trade routes of the world. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to get from Turkey to Egypt, you had to go through Israel. If you wanted to go from Egypt to Greece, you had to go through Israel a lot of the time, unless if you were taking a boat. If you wanted to go from Persia to Turkey or Egypt, a lot of the time you would pass through Israel. So it wasn't just a major trade road of the Roman world, it was a major trade road of the international world at the time. Mm-hmm. People went from India through Israel to get to places in the Roman Empire and vice versa. So this was not a like corner of the world. This was a major place. And that's why so much world history is revolved around the Middle East and around Israel in particular, because it is at the crossroads of trade of multiple continents. Mm-hmm. Africa, Europe, Asia, all cross through Israel. You could go and you could say, hey, did Jesus heal you of blindness? And the person would say, yes, for sure. And you could go around and ask other people, was this person blind before? And they would say, yeah, for sure. Was this person crippled before? Yeah, for sure. Did Jesus heal them of that? Absolutely, Jesus healed them of that. Mm-hmm. And there were so many cases of it too, that if it wasn't real, you would have known because people would have said so. Mm-hmm. Think about how many people hated Jesus, the Jewish leaders, the Romans, all these different people. If it wasn't true, they would have had so much ammunition, because they would have had so many people that were like, he never really healed me, blah, 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 blah. And if there's one thing that humans are great at, it's complaining. Mm-hmm. So he was a historian. He took it from a historical standpoint. We're going to use his gospel as the primary one that we're circling around. And where he starts is he starts with the birth of John the Baptist. So we saw in John that the Word became flesh, and John the Baptist was his forerunner, who essentially was functioning in the office of Elijah, who's going to come before the second return of Christ. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff here, and I think it's really important for us to remember that Jesus came with grace and truth, and that we want to be walking in the truth and pursuing truth and not being afraid to do that, but we need to do it in grace and in love. And we need to make sure that we are not falling victim to a lot of the thoughts of our time, and that we're not giving ourselves over to fear. We're not giving ourselves over to hatred or envy or any of these things. Like, we want to know the truth. And so we want to know who God is, and we want to know him better.
Agreed.
Word. Well, hope you guys join us next time. Have a great day.